We welcome you again in this conference. Welcome you again to our conference named The Palestinian City Issues in Urban Transformation. I'm really honored to be sitting among two well-known, prominent scholars in our Palestinian culture who understood very early the importance and sacredness of words in defending right and truth. They are Dr. Adil Manna' and Dr. Rasim Khamaisi. At the start, I am honored and glad to point out that Dr. Adil Manna' is one of the distinguished researchers who always sought to clarify the Palestinian fact within its historical framework in the context of time sequence and the memory of the space. He's a Palestinian well-known researcher and historian in the Arab community in Israel. His research focuses on the history of Palestine during the Ottoman time, and he occupied several positions, including the director of the Academic Institute for Preparing Arab Teachers and the director of studies of the Arab Center in Israel. And he has several publications, including a book named A Catastrophe and Existence and the Tale of Palestinians Who Stayed in Haifa and Galilee, the Arab Community, the Residence and Community and Economy, and the Palestinian scholars in late Ottoman time and history of late Ottoman time, and several publications that I cannot simply name all of them, and the research and publications done by Dr. Adil Manna'. The floor is yours, Doctor. Thank you. His microphone is off. Yeah. Good afternoon for everyone. I'm really glad to make this presentation. And this intervention. And at the conference of Institute for Palestine Studies on the Palestinian city at Birzeit University campus, where I taught for so many years in the 80s and 90s, and I'm always glad to be back here and to make presentations and join activities. Two short comments before my paper. This paper that has been selected to be in the inauguration session is an attempt to make a panoramic view about the fate of the absented Palestinian city since Nakba and the repercussions of that absence on the other Palestinian cities in general and in particular, and in 1948 in particular, and the presence and the remaining of the Nazareth, the only Palestinian city that was saved, the absence and the impact of that on the other Palestinian cities that were not saved. The second one is that this paper depends on a larger research that was mentioned, which is the book Nakba and steadfastness or presence that gives the history of Nakba and the presence of Palestinians remaining in Palestine in post-1948 Nakba. And since time is limited, naturally is to speak in a summarized way. Those who would like to get more details about the book, they can do so and buy the book. It's outside. So I'm making a promotion for my book here. Now, let's go into the paper itself. The title of the paper, Remnant, the Fates of Palestinian City in Israel between the Nakba and the Naksa. Remnants is a Spanish famous dish pronounced bayaya with Andalusi origin. It includes rice and remains of fish. Some add to this dish, which was famous among the fishermen and residents of the seashore. They add meat and groceries sometimes. And I selected the term baqaya or remnants as my title for my research about the Palestinian destroyed cities and their situation after Nakba. The Palestinian city in Israel diminished and almost was totally absented after the war of 1948. And no one was saved of this fate except the Nazareth, as I mentioned, the residents of which doubled because of the displacement of refugees from the surrounding villages. And most of these refugees came from other displaced villages such as Safuri, Ma'lul, and Al-Majd village, and from other occupied cities such as Tiberias, Haifa, Shafa Amr, and other northern Palestine cities. This paper seeks to track the fate of the Arab residents of the seashore cities such as Acre and Haifa, Jaffa, and Al-Lud and Ramla that became to be called mixed cities in the first decade after Al-Nakba. Also, it will indicate in a summarized way to the fate of other 5 cities, which is Safad, Tiberias, Bisan, Majdal, and Bir Saba, where all of their Palestinian residents were displaced, so they were turned into purely Israeli citizens, free without their indigenous residence. By the way, and in total, out of 11 Palestinian cities occupied by Israel in 1948, only one was saved, which is the Nazareth, and few remnant Palestinian remnants of other 5 cities. The number of remaining Palestinians in these 5 cities between few thousands in some cities in Acre, Haifa, and Jaffa, and a few hundreds of Palestinians in Al-Lud and Al-Ramla. It's worth noting that these cities, except Acre, they lost their countryside, so they lost the countryside where they can be displaced to or immigrate to. And so this paper analyzes the absence of the Arab city that is from the Palestinians who were saved of dispersion and expulsion, and they lived in the Galilee and Muthallath area under the military rule. It's worth mentioning that the Bir Saba city in the Negev that was mentioned by the Ottomans in 1900 to be administrative center became a totally Jewish city after Al-Nakba. So the absence of the Palestinian city and its elite and the countrysiding of the Nazareth as a result of the Israeli policies left a clear impact on the life of others, especially in education, in the cultural and economic areas, in addition to the political one. The paper compares between the different fates of Haifa, Jaffa, the 2 cities whose Arab residents were equal, around 70,000, and compares with the fate of other residents of Acre and the remaining of residents of Al-Lud and Ramla. Also, the paper will make questions about the importance of the keeping the Nazareth on the other residents, other places who suffered total disconnection almost with the Arab surrounding Arab world, and in spite of the disconnection and Israeli military control, they succeeded in building effective political and cultural institutions, particularly in Haifa and Galilee. Also, the reasons for the development of cultural elite in Haifa and keeping Jaffa as a neglected backyard for the neighboring Tel Aviv. Also, the Arab Jaffa did not revive even after dozens of years or decades of years after the Nakba. Jaffa, that was the gate of Palestine, same as Lud and Ramla, our cities, are in the central geographic place of the country, yet its residents, they suffered double marginalization in the policies of the Israeli government and the Zionist municipalities. These policies have deepened alienation and exclusion and the crime in these communities that were suffering the colonialist settlement. Here I have a long paragraph about the Palestinian city since the late Ottoman time. I am going to cut it short, and so I will. They didn't give me. Only yesterday they informed me that I have 20 minutes. The city development, as we listened in the first intervention by Mr. Khalid Ziadi, started during the Ottoman time, but I say that the development of Palestinian city continued during the British time, and the Haifa and Jaffa, in terms of the Arab residents, they were around 70,000 in each of them, compared to around 60,000 in Jerusalem before Nakba. Also, these two cities had an important role in the political and economic and cultural and artistic life. Jerusalem, the capital, retained its religious sacredness and its attraction. And also the natural development of the Palestinian city stopped as a result of a Nakba, as happened with the Arab community in the Palestine in 1948. So in 1948, there was an occupation, an ethnic cleansing in the same year and after. The Haganah organization started the occupation and the expulsion of Palestinians from their villages and cities in northern Palestine in a systematic way since middle April 1948, according to their infamous Dalit plan. And under the leadership of Ben-Gurion in implementing that plan and in coordination with the British Army and authority. Tiberias was the first of the occupied cities, and where the citizens were expelled between April 16 and 17th in that year, and only few of them were saved of that fate, who were allowed to go to the Nazareth and live there. Again, here I am going to cut it short because this is well-known history, as happened to Tiberias, same thing to Safad and Bisan in the same time, in spring 48, then Haifa, in late April, then Jaffa, and so forth with the other Palestinian cities. Only no one was saved of this fate in 1948. As a model, only we take Majd al-Asqalan or Asqalan, which is a good example for the remaining of few thousands in 1948 and 1949. Even some of them, they joined the first elections in 1949. Yet, even those were expelled, as we know, in 1950, in October 1950, they were expelled to Gaza. So in South Jaffa, no Palestinian city or village across that seashore. Israel collected the remaining in Haifa, Jaffa, Lid, and Akka in ghettos to confiscate their property and houses. And during that time, the military rule was imposed on the Arab residents in these cities. But because of the difficulty of retaining a military rule in cities where Jews live, the military rule was ended in early 50s. The attempts to get rid of the Palestinians in North and South Palestine, even after the end of the war and signing truce with the Arab countries in 1947, and different ways, such as expulsion and under the pretext of facing those returning to their homeland, and to encourage immigration to the Arab countries and to the Argentina. And the latest ethnic cleansing was in the early days during the Suez War, 1956, when the Israeli army committed the Kufr Qasim massacre and expelled the Krad al-Baqara, Krad al-Ghanami in Sahel al-Huli area, al-Huli plains. The absence of the city and its impact on the political behavior. The absence of the city has had a clear impact on the political, economic, and cultural situation for those remaining under occupation. The national elite has disappeared after leading the resistance against the Zionist project, except the Israeli communist party leadership, where Emil Habibi and Tawfiq Toubi selected to join that party, and they entered the Israeli parliament elections in January 25 in 1949. The Israeli state did not allow for establishing any Arab party during the military rule, 48 to 66. During that, Arab lists were established along with the ruling party Mapai to gain votes instead of going to the Communist Party. Those who were cooperating with the military rule was Saifuddin al-Zu'bi, who was connected to Mapai, and al-Zu'bi did not succeed in gaining the majority of the votes of the Nazareth in spite of the support of the government and their supporters, and his depending on his extended family in 5 villages outside the Nazareth. And the communists won the election war in Nazareth that was saved the 1948 destruction. So the communists, they won more than half or 50% of the voters in the Nazareth, and this has not happened anywhere else during these elections, and not even in other elections. Nazareth was the only Arab town that did not give the majority of its votes to Mapai, the ruling Mapai party. In spite of the failure of Saifuddin al-Zu'bi to get support in his city, yet the progressive Nazareth bloc that he headed got 2 seats at the Knesset, and the second seat was from the Nazareth Amin Jarjura. In addition to them, Tawfiq Toubi from Haifa won a 3rd Arab seat as part of the Maki party. So 2 from Nazareth and 1 from Haifa. And no other Knesset member, indicating that directly after the Nakba, this showed the role of the remnants remaining there. The center of political and parliamentary representation for the remaining Palestinians in Haifa and Nazareth remained for several decades, and the Israeli government, after the success of communists in the Nazareth and other Arab towns, Israel tried to defeat them, and one of the steps to achieve that was to allow the lawyer Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari from Nazareth to return to the country, and allowed to George Hakim to return to Haifa, along with Hawari, to make competitive political ones. So in the second Israeli parliament election in 1951, a larger number of Arab voters. So in addition to the residents of Al-Muthallath, many Arabs in North Palestine and South and Negev for the first time participated in the elections, and the percentage of Arab voters turnout was 86%. Imagine in the recent elections, they were speaking about joint bloc, the recent election. At that time, people were afraid of voting under the military rule. The ruling Mapai succeeded in weakening support for the communist Arab. So the two Arab blocs connected to it got 5 out of the 8 members. So in addition to Saifuddin Zu'bi in his bloc, 2 other members were elected, Mas'ad Qassis from Ma'lia and Jabr Ma'addi Ad-Dahish from Yarka. Haifa got the major share in representing the Arabs in the Knesset with the 3 representatives. Emil Habibi joined his comrade Tawfiq Toubi as representative for Maki, communist. Also, Ristom Bastoni was representative for the leftist Mapam party, and these 3 of them, they represented the bold opposition in facing the Israeli military rule and harassment of the Arabs. 7 minutes. Thank you. The results reflected the policies of the ruling Mapai and divide and rule. And the election and the intelligence, Israeli intelligence, had an important role in selecting the candidates for the Arab lists to show that they are affiliated to the Jewish state. And 2 of the 8 representatives, Ma'addi and Khnefis, were from the Druze, and the 3, Toubi, Habibi, and Mas'ad Qassis from the Christians. And this political representation reflected the absence of the city and the poor role for the remaining elite in leading the others in occupied Palestine in 1948. Okay, again, I will go directly to the cultural and economic cost for the absence of the city. The city during the British mandate was hiring the excess labor force from the Palestinian rural areas and who lived in the city. Many of them, they prefer to travel and commute every day from their village to the city. The remainings in the Galilee, they lost their jobs in Tabari, Safad, and Bisan, Akka, because of the absence of the Arab employers. And the Israeli authorities preferred to hire the newly immigrated Jews and imposed the military rule on the others, limiting their movement. That's why the Arab laborers preferred to return to work in agriculture after working for several years in services and in factories. And this absence of the city was reflected from a cultural point of view, where many newspapers and magazines were published in Jaffa and Haifa were closed down, and many cultural and educational institutions did not exist anymore after the expulsion of the elite during the Nakba. And to indicate to the absence of those, to mention that the number of Arab lawyers in post-Nakba was not more than 10. Now, in any small village in these areas, you find 30 or 40 lawyers. Also, the number of Arab high schools was less than 5. The majority of doctors, lawyers, and engineers, and pharmacists, and others of academic professions until 1948, they studied in Beirut and Cairo. After cutting the communication between the remainings in Israel and others, those they lost any opportunity for social activism, and so the graduates of high schools, they had to overcome several obstacles in accessing the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the only university in early 50s, except the Technion. The number of Arab students at the Hebrew University and the Technion Institute in early 50s that very few of the Arabs succeeded in that difficult mission. Acceptance to the university was close to impossible, especially for medicine and law and engineering faculties, and accessing the university required a permit from the military rule. And those who overcome that obstacle and acceded the Israeli academia had to overcome that alienation and the feeling of competing with the Jews with their mother tongue Hebrew language. There were very few research about the absence of the Palestinian city in Israel and its impact on impoverishing the others. And so Manar Hassan, when she wrote a PhD, published a PhD about the effect on the absence of the Palestinian city and that impact on the Palestinian women and its memory. Also, Israel worked on absenting the source of knowledge and to create a faked, created sources on the memory. Here there is a long paragraph, 2 minutes, so I have to cut it short. So I will ignore the attempts of mobilizing and blurring the Arab identity and go directly to the conclusion. Israel, since 1948, established hundreds of settlements, including new cities for Jews only, such as Upper Nazareth, and Carmel, while the state did not build not a single city for Arabs in order to accommodate the increased Arab population in the central and northern of the city. Instead, they harassed the Israeli military rule, harassed the Arab towns and took their resources. Those remaining in Israel for a decade endured the shock of the Arab defeat and the oppression of the military rule and their disconnection from the Arab world, and the absence of the Palestinian city and its political and cultural elite has had a great impact on their already shaken, poor capacity in organizing themselves and challenging the occupation. Nonetheless, in spite of the challenge, they retain their Arab identity and their right to live in dignity in their homeland. After winning the battle of existence, it was natural that Nazareth was a place to challenge the deformed Israeli identity by making celebrations of the first 10 years of independence in the Arab schools. And the first Arab demonstration in the Nazareth, this demonstration was rejecting the celebration of Israeli independence. The police intervened against that peaceful demonstration, so violent confrontation happened, leading dozens of the injured and arrest of hundreds of the first uprising for those remaining in northern Palestine. Nonetheless, the leaders of the Popular Front, that included the communist and nationalist activists, they visited the prisoners and defended them in the courts. Last paragraph, and after decades of Nakba, the Nazareth and its mayor Tawfiq Zayad played an important roles during the land aid in 1976, and the remaining of Palestinians, they succeeded in the steadfastness battles in recent decades. The many villages that remained after Nakba, such as Taiba, Al-Fahim, Sakhnin, and others, today now they are vibrant cities with dozens of thousands of citizens in each of them. The Upper Nazareth that was established, which is called in Hebrew Nazaret Elite, until recently they changed its name. It was established to suffocate the Nazareth. Now it's a mixed city, according to the Israeli terminology, where more than 10,000 Arab residents live. In these developments, and in spite of the Israeli policy of suffocation and discrimination, there is some hope for the continuation of the success of the battle of steadfastness and construction. And one last word, maybe it's a good coincidence that on the same days of this conference in Haifa, there is the city exhibition and arts exhibition from November 1st to November 3rd, indicating to the attempts to regain the Arab city in some places, especially in Haifa. So maybe Zorbi can speak about this, so we'll listen to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your keenness to commit to the given time from Rana. And thank you for your constant reference about the political, social, and economic landscape in the Palestinian cities and in the transformations of these cities before the occupation and after it. These cities, as we all know, were inhabited with its people and with their thriveness, and of course the reference of the destruction of Palestinian cities and the practices of ethnic cleansing and other practices related to military and to residency. We now are to listen to Dr. Rasem Khamaise to tell us more about a context that's relevant to the previous context about the Palestinian city in encirclement, exclusion, and development. He is a researcher specialized in urban studies, and he has headed the cities of Galilee. He is the head of the Geographical Council in, but that was a long time ago. All that you've mentioned was a long time ago. Now we look in the history of the place, in the memory of the place with him. He has, he was the author of many publications. The book of the Israeli policy in demolishing Palestinian cities and a number of other publications that I could not really count here. And some of them were related to old features, and some are related to new features. And so the floor is yours, Dr. Rasem, about the Palestinian city. No. It's off. It's off. It's off. It's off. It needs to turn the mic on. طفى الميكروفون. خليه يضوي الميكروفون. طفى الميكروفون. The mic is off. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the Institute for Palestine Studies for inviting me. I will address the Palestinian city issues of encirclement, exclusion, and development. Until they post it, actually, I address the concept of the Palestinian city. The Palestinian city is in need to have a clear identification. What is a Palestinian city? We a Palestinian city since when? How is it linked? How is it distinct? What are the characteristics and the specificity in this reality if we regard it horizontally and vertically? And what I care about in the study of a city is practically not only to stand on the status of a city, on its development, but it's an attempt to read the landscape of the city and its transformations and how can we prepare it to a better future. I believe this is a challenge by itself, and we should have additional study days to discuss this matter as a planner. I'm not only a geographer person or specialized in geography. When I was checking the map of Ramallah this morning and was just checking the road network, I said that in 1985 and 1997, how did we start to map the streets? How to do it's their structure in order to map it as a city. So this is where I say, how can we transform from explaining the phenomena of a city, and how can we come up with a new film. And this is something very big, and I would like to tell you about the segments of it. This is Jerusalem 1937, Jerusalem 2018, and the transportations within the city. This lecture will present criticism about the division and the transformations in the city. Dr. Adel addressed the era of the 50s. I would like to see the historic sequence in these segments, how to encircle the Palestinian city and its just political status. Is there a specificity of Palestinian city or it is like other cities throughout the world? They are targeted we address the Palestinian cities within the green line and in their as a model. Nazaret was in 1987 and Ramallah in 1908. So this is by the Ottoman law under the different Israeli jurisdiction. So we're talking here about the different control between in the different status of cities due to a certain paradigm. So is the city in the Palestinian coastline different than the city in a mountainous area? Is it different than a city inside the Green Line or outside the Green Line? These questions need to be addressed and be understood. And to projections, how can this encirclement and expansion be calculated in the Israeli context, and how can we address them in the future? This methodology depends on monitoring and critical analysis, depending on narratives and statistics that we have to think of. When we study the Palestinian cities' status and historical status, there's a big dialogue and discussion between the historians where were the first historic cities in the past? Jericho, Damascus, what? And Palestine, geographically, as in its geopolitical identification, is the center of all these civilizations. So that's why we see that the change in this city has changed on 4 dimensions that I would like to present, especially that there are new readings about the city, and we're now in the 21st century. It's the century of the city and throughout the world. And it's not only that we care for the city and that because Haifa is resuming modernization and so on, the civil society organizations, the relation in violence. There are many issues. There's not enough research and studies that address the transformations that erupted in the Palestinian society that related to the landscape of city, the personality of a city, especially that we see that the future is the whole world is within a city. We know that 55 to 60% of people throughout the world live in cities, and this rate is expected to raise to 70%, and the same will happen in Palestine. So there are different cultural landscapes and scenes, like Dr. Khalid Ziada said, talked about the former buildings and what's relating them, administrating the cities, smart cities, global cities. These concepts we need to understand and read well in the Palestinian context. And now the main question is, where is the similarity? Where are the differences in the styles of cities? We see that normally this is the cycle of life of all cities. A city has 4 components. The first is it's the time frame, and then the location. In not only place is a place, we means that it's with its meanings. And the human, and here I'm talking about all cultures and concepts, and the political system that has to do with the typology of a city. and its characteristics. When we check the characteristics of a Palestinian city, we need to answer some questions that I will present in my in my allowed 20 minutes. We practically see that there's a state of before 1948 and the state of after post 1948. So this is talking the time frame, and then after 67, and throughout the 67, which could be divided into several also segments. And then we try to do a reading for the future until 2040, 2050 to check the status of cities. We here see that inside Palestinian cities, we talk about Palestinian cities and not Palestinian city, but cities, because inside cities, and here we talk about Palestine. Here I'd like to quote from the geography, from Jamal Hamdan, the specialist in about Egypt. And here I would like to say, and I hope that I wish I have the capacity to write about the Palestinians. This is a reality that I would like to present. We see that most Palestinian cities, and this is one of the assumptions, say, are medium cities. We don't have millennium cities, million cities, and maybe we won't have million people cities, maybe in Gaza, but we don't have million people cities in Palestine, and this is related to the geographical position of Palestine. Actually, practically, it was the encirclement and the expansion that has erupted. The state of there are external factors related to the colonialism, to the halting the occupation to reproduce cities. And I think here there's a valid point related to the problem of identifying the Arab city. The Islamic city and another identification order to do reading that is imposed on us, and the cognitive rule that we usually refer to, it's that is inherited from the West. And according still there is no much attempt to do our own readings. There are attempts, activities that I want to discuss now, but up till now, we did not read in depth, especially in the state of linkage with internal transformations within our society. Are we a civil Palestinian society? If yes, what are its features? Is it according to the Western school of liberal Western school, or is it still tribal, and the locations are the ones that influence the cohesion within the city, the migration from one place to another, and their acceptance, as Dr. Samil has said, the mother of the stranger, like Jaffa, it's ready to recruit. My big question, even the cities that my colleague Dr. Adel has mentioned, Nazareth has acceptance for internal immigration. However, all Arab cities after 1948 there is no preparedness, community preparedness or cultural, to accept any immigration to it. They're growing due to the natural population growth. So these external forces and external forces have affected the position, the status of the cities in a reality where there are no compatibility between the external forces and the internal ones. Practically, this leads to some tensions. And when we check the Palestinian city, we see that there are cities like Nablus, New Polis. We see that there's a historic antiquity or archaeological ruler that have transformed throughout the course of time, but need to be re-identified. and these out of these footage came nucleus. There was the nucleus of towns which have expanded. Some of them became phenomenal. Some of them have diminished. And actually, having a Palestinian location, a geographical location, have affected. And the climate has affected the identity of Palestinian cities throughout the different eras, historical eras. Geographically, we see that if you see Palestine, the climate of Palestine, the geography of it, and we see that horizontally it's about 60 kilometers. There's the climate, the Mediterranean climate, and mountainous climate, and desert climate. And if we check it horizontally, vertically, there are different types of climates and have related to the type of stone, plants, architecture, and so on. And the division that led to demolish the Palestinian city, it is to expel the middle class, which was before the 1948, which started to erupt during the British mandate that have influenced developing an urban city. It gave Jerusalem the strength in order to receive all powers, and it also empowered Haifa over Akka, and also the Jordan Valley, like Bisan, Jericho, and Beersheba, where the patterns differ in talking about cities, shape, and the network that was there, since Palestine is a small country, but it's a small country, but with lots of varieties, and this is about cities, villages, and then the Bedouin compounds. This urban network, there is and if we check it, they are connected. It's this urban Palestinian network is connected with the Israeli network, and therefore there is this encirclement in this network. It has its strength, the resources of the state, there's control that encircle the Palestinian city, even inside the West Bank, where they're starting to work on their urbanization. Accordingly, I've summarized in this category, we have cities of the mountains, cities of the coast, cities of the Jordan Valley, would have different functions in disseminating the Palestinian city style. And we see that it is a state of dissemination. The state of Ramallah after 1993 to recruit immigration from the different Palestinian cities is part of this model to form this Palestinian state. It's like in Amman and other places. It was related to the political situation with the advancement of the Palestinian Authority. It is part of the Jerusalem urban planning. And this segment, it is, and here this slide is. I try to connect between the transformation of the city as between the nucleus of the city, which has formed during a long process through the Ottoman period, and even before it had its own components. Nazareth during the Ottoman period also had different variations, but until 1917 there was no systematic non-intervention. Because Palestine was there, and the cities were in the different areas. They weren't in Beirut was the center, or Damascus, or Constantine, or Istanbul, and Cairo. Therefore, they were there as they weren't in the center. They were on the background. And then after 1917, they started to come up the establishment of the national state. They started to be formed by the Palestinian National Force in parallel with the Zionist movement that have come up with the Hebrew city. And in competitiveness, in Haifa, there were Jews and Arabs, Zionists and Palestinians were living together. Tel Aviv was a neighborhood parallel next to Jaffa. And in 1921, Rokah said that today we've established the Hebrew state when they established the Bank Palestina. So the Hebrew city needed support, and the Palestinian city needed support. So they were competing with each other. The second phase of their establishment was the mandate, where there was the change in the physical landscape or vision or scenery of a city. Acre started to get out of this, out of its walls, and formed a new model. Even the model like Bir Siba that was planned according to this network model, and Hassan Al-Thani was the first mayor in order to become a center for the services of the surrounding towns. It was this colonialism model that got into this. And the third phase that we see now is in resuming modern civilization. There was like a hybrid of these segments. It created a state which I can call, it's a city that looks for its own identity in a state where there is variation and challenges within this conflict. We see here the Palestinian city has established physically in a different way. Even within the same city, we see the nucleus, the mandate, and then the colonization, depending on the governing or the ruling authority then. And I hope we can discuss this later on. These cities, like Bir Siba, according to the modern network, there's Nazaret, Tulkarem, and Visan. So these models, the maps were before 1948, show us how the city was formed. It was not planned, without any guidance except Bir Siba. And when we check cities during the British mandate, and I don't want to go in depth in this, in a pattern that introduced to us types of cities like after the Industrial Revolution, and that brought it into Palestine, and which led to imposing new styles. And then new styles of cities came up, like Haifa, Jaffa, and a village like Salfit then. So in Nablus, this plan was came in late because they were late in preparing their master plans. So practically, the Palestinian society needed to have its elites. These elites that came in, they were clans, tribes, and they started inhabiting these cities with villages who were around, like Zobia. Zobia lived in Nazareth in the center, but they came from villages. It's a social matrix where the city was the center and the neighboring villages followed it. In 1948, I can say I would like to the imputation of the Palestinian natural expansion. So it's a cleansing of the city within a city, and it was parallel to the and this had happened inside the 1948 lands, where it was the control of the rural societies. Even those who migrated to Nazareth were practically their village people, rurals. They inhabited in the on the outskirts of the city, and I hope that now and they created a sort of conflict between the center of city geographically and socially and people in the outskirts of the city. And then in 1997, during the story of Shahabuddin, it really expressed this status where there is no cohesion in a city within the center and the outskirts, but it was only based on recruitment. So when we check this Nakba was within a city as a central component within it. And when we check the data, we find that most cities, their population increased by between 1955 until 2017. The increase in population was 700 to 900%. And now a city like Rahat, which was only Bedouin cities in 1970, it was just acknowledged, and now it's inhabited by 70,000 people. And in 2030, it's expected to have 120 or 130,000 people. But at the beginning, it was planned on the base of clans. So there are 36 neighborhoods. So the question here, what type of a Palestinian city has the same status? As for modernization after in 1967 and Gaza, all West Bank cities and Gaza, they referred back to Amman. That was the center, but then they started developing more and more. So they were like followers. In the Gaza Strip, they followed Egypt and Cairo, but there was this phenomena that erupted within the Palestinian cities that needs to be studied, and we're going to do this study about the establishment of refugee camps. So here we have a deviation in the case in the West Bank. Since I have to stop shortly, I will just want to ask, how can the Palestinian Authority get the Palestinian state from this state of encirclement and exclusion? This is a central question that we need to study in a way that, in addition to facing the external factors, how can we build the Palestinian culture, community, and status and identity in order to reform itself? And when we check that all Palestinian cities are small cities. The biggest is Hebron, and its population only census is 2,000. And Nablus, same. Gaza and Khan Yunis about 5,000. So this phenomena is how can we rebuild them? This is a pattern from Acre. Adel has discussed, like others, we see that the coast city, that the center of a city was inside the walls, and up till now it lost its identity because there's a need to read. But by the way, the number, the census of population in Gaza, the Arabs exceed the number of Arab Palestinians before the 1948, and this is the municipality of Jaffa, which has transformed from the small city where it had the Al-Hamra cinema. Now it's a neighborhood, very deteriorated neighborhood in comparison to Tel Aviv. So Nazareth, within the center of Nazareth, it's 80,000, but the circling areas are 80. more than 80,000, then how can we have a city where there is complementary within its the categories of its population? This all these things are references to the change that is happening. Also, Nablus has it's like the city within the two mountains. But then, and there are camps like Askar and Barata and Rafidia, Azerbaijan, where there is modernization. And that's the coastline from Nablus. We see that the coastline, that was the city in Ramallah. It's also becoming a large urban area. So this consumption state of these cities, how can we develop a society of a city within these suits? And I'm going to stop here, and I will leave to you to read the conclusion and the recommendations. My message, I think, in my humble opinion, that there is a need to conclude forums, conferences, because reading a Palestinian city is a main component in reading the Palestinian city and the physiological changes that happen within its society. Also, the political components. A city has to do with is relevant to the psychological, political, and social patterns, and the linkage between the past, the present, and the and to prepare for the future. This is our duty as historians, as researchers, in order to engineer, to architect our awareness of the past in order to build the future generation. If the average of population is 22 years, until 50 years later, it will be still a young society that we need to develop. And thank you very much.
Microphone. I'm sorry, he is not using his microphone. Yeah. And in his speech about the use, about reading the future and holding other future conferences on the subject due to its extreme importance in our Palestinian life. Thank you. Now we start listening to, if there are questions, to our two scholars. I prefer at the start that those asking the questions introduce themselves and tell us who should answer the question in order to take the largest possible number of questions. Good afternoon. Yeah. The two speakers did excellent presentation historically and culturally, and they really complement each other. Question to Dr. Manna. There is a need to discuss the statistical aspects, such as the demographic intensity, density, and the social composition of the Arabs in Israel in the cities where they exist. As for Rasim, he really presented a marvelous panorama on the nature of civilization in the Palestinian city. Now the differences between the question is differences between the Palestinian city within the framework of Palestinian Authority and Israel, the difference in both contexts. Also, another question which is highly important, which is the separation wall that was built and the impact of which on the Palestinian cities that the wall cuts through. Thank you. Microphone, madam. I'm sorry, I can't hear her. If someone's speaking, then they have to switch on. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the great event. I have two questions. My name is Himmat Zabi. My first question to Professor Adel. I really wanted to listen more from you. How do you explain the reasons of steadfastness for the Palestinians? There in the book that you could have spoken more or elaborated more on the reasons for. And also the modalities, 85% of voter turnout out of their fear. So this question is related to your question, if you can elaborate further. A comment to Professor Rassam. I think this is my estimation that there are no critical studies about the Palestinian city. Correct me if I am wrong. Maybe part of the critical studies about the Islamic city, such as Janet Abu Lughod and Andre Rimon, these writings started in early 50s. Anyway, the critical discussion and definitions of the city as Islamic city, and I believe during this time, like in post-50s, there were geographic studies on Damascus and other cities. But Palestine was not included because Palestine was under occupation. And so the geographic space was controlled by Israel. So maybe in geography, this could be an interpretation why critical studies about the city was not there on Palestine. The second comment is the internal immigration or displacement. We cannot study this without studying the Israeli public spaces. And coming from sociological point of view, and my focus on humans, any family that would like to move to live in Ashkelon, they would have to look for kindergartens, for schools. So the absence of cultural, educational organizations for Palestinians remain confined to their villages, where you find demographic density there. Maybe it's there in the paper, and you did not mention, so maybe this is an opportunity for you to discuss. And final question. You pointed out to internal and external factors, the external colonialist one and the internal one, the cultural one, as if they are separate. Please explain to us if they are interrelated or interconnected or separate. Thank you. Saad Amiri. Dr. Adel Manna. I'd like to ask you about smaller things. First of all, I congratulate you on the selection of the term remnants. Also, although it is depressing, but it was good selection. As for the Nazareth, I never understood the theories about Nazareth surviving out of all these cities. Did the Vatican interfere? I don't know why. The second thing, with the number of residents in Jaffa. Many sources, they say before 1948, there were 100,000, 120, some they said 150, and you said 70,000. And since I am from Jaffa, I am interested in knowing the actual number of residents before 1948. Also, the situation of Arabs. Why the Arabs in Jaffa is really dissatisfied compared to Arabs in elsewhere. Thank you. As you mentioned, my name is Muhammad Abdul Hamid. as you both mentioned, there is an ethnic cleansing that ended the Palestinian city. It did not allow for building a single city. This process continues even in the situation of Palestinian cities in the West Bank or in the 1967 occupied territories. If you follow Jerusalem, how it declined from a city to less than a city, considering the suffocation and Israelization within the greater Israeli city. My question, can the Palestinian city be rebuilt away from the economic, social structure naturally? And the subject that can clarify this, when Rawabi was built, or even the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, you feel that these are not cities. There is something artificial here. Look at Ofra settlement there, east of Ramallah. Sometimes you mix it with a military camp or something that makes you tense whenever you pass. A city is not closed. Or even Rawabi that has carnival nature. How to rebuild in detachment of the development of this formation to show something natural development that is not built. Even the Ramallah model that is developing into cement blocks, sporadic one. It's not a city as according to the social and cultural understanding of a city. Abdul Qadir. It seems that the sociological studies recently are based on 2 points. The first one is the disconnection of the Palestinian group created by Nakba, as done by Shireen Saikhali in economy and Ismail al-Nashif in thought. And there is another approach, which is cutting off the city as adopted seemingly by the two presenters today. The question, is a Nakba, if it did not happen, could we have been able to see Palestinian modernization in our cities? And if true, why we didn't have this in the non-occupied cities or in the only Arab city that survived, or that is similar to the Mediterranean basin area, or the cities that are still looking for identity. Meaning, can you clarify what is the Palestinian city that, or let's say there was a civilization, a civil culture that was amputated or killed, and there is a city without clarifying any meaning that is meant, or what was the city that was cut off or amputated? The question is for Dr. Rasim, for both. Okay, we are done with this number. Now we listen to the answers, then back to other questions. The first question, Dr. Adil Manna. Thank you. The paper is not a quantitative one, like dealing with statistics and so forth, but rather it's an attempt to read the absence of the Palestinian city and its impact. But since you are interested in some statistics, it is there. I said remnants In the mixed cities, between hundreds and thousands. Overall, it's around 10% of the remaining residents in northern Palestine. Because we are speaking about 3,000 in Acre, in 3,000 in Haifa, similar in Jaffa, and few hundreds in Jaffa. Totally around 10 to 12,000 maximum. And these make around 10% of the population in the north before moving the north from Jordan to Israel. The remaining Palestinian residents, whose number was 1949, they were 160,000. Now their number is more than 1.5 million, not including Jerusalem, because Israeli statistics, they include Jerusalem. We are not speaking about Jerusalem. Meaning that these remaining residents, they doubled more than 10 times since Al-Nakba until this day. Did the population double in the village, in the city as much as in the village? In the Nazareth, we said the number was doubled because of immigration. Today, they said their population is around 80,000, which is the largest city, not necessarily to stay for long. And the remnants, not only 5, because there are new cities, such as the Upper Nazareth, as I mentioned, and elsewhere. So the number of residents increased. In Haifa, more than 30,000 now. And I connect this with another question, as Saad's question about Haifa and Jaffa. Why is there an attempt to regain the Palestinian city and successfully do that, compared to Jaffa that is still suffering many issues, socially, culturally, and violence and others? And I indicated in one of the reasons to attribute that to the absence of the rural support, such as in Lod, Ramli, Jaffa, because in this area there are no remaining residents to immigrate to Jaffa as a middle class, as happened with Haifa. In Haifa, the number of population basically was a middle class people leaving the village. They studied and they wanted to live a city life, and Haifa is a bigger city from Acre and others. So immigration to Haifa was a quality, not a quantity one. Also, Israel allowed for many cultural institutions and others to grow in Haifa, including the Communist Party and their newspaper that was in Jaffa, Al-Ittihad or the Union. They allowed it to be published only in Haifa, not in Jaffa. And there are many other reasons. Maybe of these reasons, Tel Aviv, the Israeli Hebrew city, it is practically made Jaffa, as I mentioned, as a backyard for the city. All the crimes and everything and the harassment for the population continued for a long period of time, leaving Jaffa in a situation that's much worse than Haifa. The population is 70,000. Those who speak about 100 and 120, unfortunately, sometimes even among researchers, we find exaggerations that are needless. There are accurate exercises for the number of population who were living there, such as those who used to work in orchards and other. In Haifa and Jaffa, there were around 70,000. Of the exaggerations that we find among researchers, not only Palestinians who are supporters to the Palestinians, like in 1948, some exaggerate, say that Israel expelled 1 million Palestinians. It's not true, because all those were living there. We didn't have 1 million. The total number of Palestinians in 1948 was 1,300,000 350. So how could you say that expulsion of 1 million? Some students, they come and say, okay, Dr. Ilan Pape, he's a famous researcher. And yes, in his book, he says more than 1 million. Why are these exaggerations? Accuracy is a strong weapon in our hand in order to read every word and to be accurate. For Himmat's question about causes for steadfastness, although I prefer presence or staying, and this allows me to explain why they participated in elections. The reasons for steadfastness or for remaining is that the alternative is worse. And the Palestinians, particularly in northern Palestine, which is then the northern density of remaining Palestinians who fought, or maybe Israel occupied their villages and towns, and they were expelled and returned and tried to stay. And as I mentioned, they were occupied in late time in 1948. The issue of refugees did not happen in 1 or 2 or 3 months. It started in late 47. Some of them were expelled during that time, and this continued even after 1948 and the return attempts as well. In northern Palestine, people tried, like those living in refugee camps in Lebanon, how Lebanon as a state and sometimes a community, how they treat the refugees in Lebanon. So they tried that. So those who were in Lebanon, they returned. And they said, okay, humiliation in our own homeland is less worse compared to humiliation in our relative Arab countries, let's say. But there are other reasons as well. So this brings me to the next question by Suad, and I did not answer, which is the reason for Nazareth staying. Nazareth, there are 7 or 10 pages in the book. You said you didn't read it, so it's a good opportunity for you to read. But in a nutshell, and the Nazareth is staying because of the interest of the Vatican and the church and the Western countries and Ben Gurion's sensitivity, because he needed the support of these countries to allow Israel into joining the UN and political and military support. So he and another person such as Vice was the head of Karen Kayemet in his diaries. In their early days, they said, if the day comes when we start fighting for establishing the Jewish state after the 1973, when they started planning, there are 3 cities we need to take care of what we do there: Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Old Town, and Nazareth. And it's clear what is the relationship between these 3 cities, which is the sensitivity of Christian shrines there. It's clear from the ordered by Ben Gurion to the army commander Ben Kunderman, who occupied Nazareth or accepted the surrender of the Nazareth at that time. It was good that Yusuf Ahum surrendered. Ben Gurion, the only place in 1948 when he issued one order to keep the lives of civilians and their property and their holy shrines, the churches and monasteries. He did not mention mosques. mosques were not of interest for him. It was just the white mosque, but it was not his interest. So the sensitivity, it was clear why Ben Gurion issued such, and the commander of the army implemented that order. And there are many other factors. Even the leader of the salvage army told the Nazareth residents, told them, don't leave the city. Those who leave will not be allowed to return. So Nazareth residents learned a lesson from other previous cities. Tiberias, beside them, some of the residents came to Nazareth. Haifa, same thing, Shifa Amr and others, and so forth. Majority of them became refugees in diaspora. And I mentioned the factor of fear as important, but this is not the only one. The remaining, they tried to find any weapon to use in their hands to stay. So in elections, when the state and the ruling party came telling them, come and vote for us, we will construct a road for you, we'll connect you to the grid, we vote to us if you have someone who does not have an identity card, we will give him identity card. Among my family members, Manna family, in the 55, one of the family leaders, he returned with his family, and they told him, if all the Manna family vote for our party, we will give you 20 or 50 identity cards. So elections were used as a tool to gain things to stay or to sustain presence or to retain of people. I think the last question, just a short question to Abdul Qadir. If Nakba did not happen, could we have seen a modernized city, and why we didn't have that in the West Bank and Gaza? Good question. It requires deeper research, but if you allow me to improvise, in my view, Nakba was a major factor because it cut off the natural growth for the Palestinian society in general, and the city as part of that. And if you take into consideration what were the cities that were leading the civilization and culture, these were the seashore and Haifa and Jaffa. These two cities, we know what happened to them. From 70,000, only 3,000 remained. West Bank, we didn't have Palestinian rule there. Amman, as a capital and politics and government and kingdom, had effect in keeping the West Bank in its state without growth, and Gaza, that became a city of refugees after 1948. That's why it is not the city that was there before. But this requires more research. Thank you.
Actually, the questions will open up to a new lecture now. In this regard, when we question, there are many research questions, and the answer should be really methodological. It's clear, Dr. Ishaq, that concerning a city, the Arab city in Israel, in return for the Palestinian city in the West Bank or Gaza, there are different disparities. The Palestinian city in the West Bank is an expansion to a nucleus, a constant curve where there is a imitation, urban imitation from any mountain city like Hebron, Jerusalem, Nablus. These cities, they're imitating or following. It's not like Tulkir, Qalqilia, Jenin. These are traditional, they're distinction. But even Nazareth, we're talking about as a city, it wasn't even, it didn't reach this level. It was a city that have come up was established at the start of the 18th century as a nucleus, and then in the 17th century it was referred to as a small village where the Franciscan wrote about. So it wasn't really a city. So we see that the cities is different than the Arab cities in Israel. They are cities between brackets. They came up or they're erupted because of the accumulation, the growth, demographic growth, but there's no migration. And the middle class was developed not because of the economic development, but in the West Bank, the city up till 1993 was following or imitating other cities outside Palestine, like Amman. It's not really the urban model. Amman also expanded due to migrations, and this has also had to have its own conference. But the Arab Palestinian land up to now isn't really here, is not really fabric. There are many questions that I want to go in depth now because it needs a whole new lecture. Now the disparity or there's the dispute is that there's amputation of some features, like in Jerusalem. It's cities in the we see there's a relationship between all the geography of all. When there's the parallel of a city is strong. Haifa, for instance. So wherever it has an alternate or a corollary between the cities, we talk about 500,000 people who live on daily. They commute daily to Haifa. But so it is a state where there's no new formation for the Palestinian identity, and the wall. Like in a city that was well studied, like for instance, Qalqilia, the wall has really circulated it, encircled it, and excluded it. So functionally, the many processes are not happening. The wall has affected the structure of Palestinian cities, whether between the cities or among the cities. And it had cut all linkages between, for instance, Beit Jala, Bethlehem, Beit Sahur with Jerusalem, Ramallah with Jerusalem, and Ramallah and Elbira, they're together. So we see towns like Ram, Anata, and others. They've had expanded and they've transformed on their reality. I agree with you. The Arab mentality up till now is not really critical. Up till now it's not critical, and I'm saying this really. We're more like we're more narrative. We like to read certain justifications without going in depth in the. Especially with studies that we don't, especially we in the 1948, there are not enough studies. So there is a need that we tweet outside the flock, that we have critical studies in order to establish or develop our own national scheme that is stemmed on values, including the reformation of cities. That's why we did not question. We all have nostalgia for Jaffa. Okay, Jaffa is only 70,000. It's not a city. It was. Then it had a theater and newspapers in the context. Then it was very significant and important. But in order to say that this national project will reach something, the resumption of it was due to a direct conflict with the Zionism scheme, and it wasn't accepted by an Islamic will or an Arab will. It has created a state, that the Palestinian state. Then, as Rashid Khaldi has described it, that we're like in a jail, and this is the case in which has affected the formation of the city. So, actually, this had led to many conflicts, and in comparison, where there was synergies between them, and whoever thinks that they were separated is mistaken. Arif has said so. It is a state. And by the way, the state is still up till now. It's the justification of external factors, and to resort to them more than to read how to do the transformation. My father told me once, you don't need to be excellent over the moon. You need to be excellent here on the ground. So let's be realistic. And when we read, and actually this is in addition to Dr. Adel, when we set a plan, or the map of separation, the division in 1948, we check it and we see that the displacement, there is a linkage between the map of displacement and the migration that happened, except for Fredis, that was protected by its council, and another one, which is Jisr al-Zakra. Other than that, all of them were wiped out, and all the others were wiped out. In Nazareth, even the Battle of Aylabun, the geography of the place had played a role on who stays within this zone or not. So there was this migration of refugees. After the migration of refugees, the 40% of them were refugees who lived in them. So, and there's no acceptance for migration, because our linkage to ruralism are not reasons about how to open up to the Hebrew cities. They were keen to displace these Arab to the center of cities. This was how to handle the regional cities policies with municipal policies. So we need to read what happens within the policies within the Hebrew cities, the Israeli cities, and their influence on our behaviors. We're not talking about Judaization policies, other policies. According to the census of 2017, the inhabitants within the cities, about 30,000 cities. And I give you accurate questions. And these are not the mixed cities. There's now migration. It's occupational migration that has started to be seen in cities where they need to work, or due to the industrial revolution. Up till now, our society is very much linked to the outskirts of the city, and there is when we talk displacement or people, and this happens in Ramallah as well. Even the society does not really accept those who come from the outskirts of Ramallah, because they look down on them, and this is also usually in cities that are in the center of country, because it has not developed into a big city, and it's not an exceptional case to if we compare it to other cases throughout the world. As for can we rebuild? Well, we need to understand the identification of a city. Think about the cities of gardens, where there are 30,000 people. There are million inhabitant people. There are social cities. So we need to differentiate between the physical structure of a city or the city with civic functions. Which it can it does economic revolt. This we need to be more accurate typologically in order not to merge or to read Rawabi, in order not to compare Rawabi with Ramallah. There's a big difference. It's an activity. in 1995 when we approved that study about new cities with existing cities as a developmental leverage. There were discussions about this, and the settlements also, to compare settlements with a Palestinian city. This is problematic and this is a problem in identifying the term itself and understanding it, and I think it's more than that. So this criticism between a village, we're beyond the criticism of a village or a city. There's no city nor village. There's, as we said, it's like a fan. It's a sequence where some cities start up and then they link together. And it's more criticism than the simple idea that we had. They come from a village or they come from a city. This in the global network of cities. This has gone. Ramallah, it has an internal problem even in the society, and I've known this. I was one of those who planned, was of the planners of Ramallah. I worked with El Bira and Qalqilia, all these cities, and Nazareth. So I'm not there to analyze only, but I was trying to think critically how people think. The society try to save their opportunities, their limited opportunities, and they feel that there's zero gain. So it's not about that we can accumulate this economic leverage. There's this competitiveness between the cities, and it needs to be reread in order to develop this complementary network between cities. And today, if we look at it from an aerial picture, we see that Jerusalem is not only the old city. This is very wrong. Jerusalem, the old city is important, but we mean that from Birzeit to Beit Varjar, they're practically one city. Inside them there are different communities, and the Israeli occupation have separated them by giving them different identities, and we deal together according to the color of the identity, the ID card. This is why we need to read more, to be more critique, and in order to restructure the national project and to reform it. And I think in this, the concept of a city need to be reconsidered. If the Nakba wasn't there, and this is a virtual question, but we can say like, if I want to think, how are we going to be in 2030 or 2030, 2040? It's clear that the Palestinian society was growing demographically, and it was recruiting population, and there's now competitiveness within the Palestinian society between those who seek equality to those who seek liberation within the Palestinian city in the West Bank or Gaza, and to have the nostalgia to what was there outside the homeland, but yet they wanted this center in the city. And we see this seasonal migration to Ramallah, where most of them come from Makhmas, Tumar, and Turmasaya. They invest within the city, but there's this inflation that is not appropriate. Accordingly, we're in the reformation of our cities. The city is not. There is a need to try to come up with a new paradigm on how to build a Palestinian city socially, and not to imitate it or bring it ready-made from another city, just like now in New York or city. We need to downscale this. We need to put ourselves with competitive cities with the institutions, I mean municipalities. And administrating the municipalities have a central role in establishing the Palestinian national city. And this is actually difficult. Thank you, Dr. Rassam. I think we need to stop here. Shall we take 2 more questions? We're late. we're late. Um, so we need to stop here. Uh, okay, thank you. Thank you very